Respiration is a chemical reaction that happens in all living cells, including plant and animal cells. Respiration allows all cells to harvest energy from a breakdown of glucose and oxygen, forming carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the process. Now, this energy comes in the form of a very important molecule called ATP. ATP is like the currency for energy. The body can spend ATP to carry out other processes in the body which require energy, such as pumping out ions in active transport. ATP is even needed for respiration to occur. So, after you eat something, some of the food gets broken down into glucose. This is where respiration starts, and there are 4 parts: glycolysis, link reaction, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Glycolysis is the splitting of the glucose molecule into 2 pyruvates. This is a long process, and 2 things are of note here. Firstly, at some point, a coenzyme called NAD+ rips off hydrogens to form NADH. All these coenzymes do is carry hydrogen atoms to the electron transport chain, which is data. Secondly, we will feed 2 ATP molecules at the start of glycolysis. Adenosine triphosphate only consists of a nucleotide of 3 phosphate groups. When we feed 2 ATP molecules into glycolysis, we are essentially ripping the N-phosphate group of ATP and forming ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, which only has 2 phosphate groups, and then 1 phosphate group appears at the end. This ripping off of a phosphate group produces a large amount of energy and is called dephosphorylation. This allows glucose to be broken down. Glycolysis is a series of many reactions, and we call it a metabolic pathway. This diagram will only show the important parts for A-level. 2 ATP has their phosphate groups ripped off, forming fructose 1,6-biphosphate. Now, 2 NAD+ molecules rip off a hydrogen atom each in a dehydrogenation reaction. At the same time, 2 ADP molecules plus 2 phosphate groups join together again in a phosphorylation reaction to form 2 ATP again. This is exactly the opposite as the first part. 2 phosphoenopyruvates, or PEP, are formed, and another ADP phosphorylation occurs for each of the molecules, forming 2 pyruvates, concluding glycolysis. During this process, we go up 2 ATP at the start, but form 4 ATP, giving us a net gain of 2 ATP per glucose molecule. The second part of respiration is the link reaction. This reaction causes pyruvate to be broken down further into acetylcoenzyme A, which is a 2-carbon compound. Another NAD+ rips off a hydrogen, and the carbon dioxide molecule is ripped off in a decarboxylation reaction. Now we come to a Krebs cycle. Acetylcoenzyme A, a 2-carbon compound, reacts with a 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetate into a citrate, which is a 6-carbon compound. The coenzyme A helps this reaction. Now a Krebs cycle is a series of dehydrogenations and decarboxylation reactions, as hydrogens and CO2 molecules are getting constantly ripped off. I won't go into the details, but a citrate, the 6-carbon compound, gets turned into an oxaloacetate, the 4-carbon compound, with 2 decarboxylations and 4 dehydrogenations, and 1 ATP is actually formed in the process. This is because there's enough energy from turning the 5-carbon acid into oxaloacetate to produce 1 ATP. It should be noted that FADH is basically NADH. It rips off hydrogens just the same. FADH is just at a lower energy level than NADH. The oxaloacetate formed is immediately available to react with another acetylcoenzyme A, and this is why it is called a Krebs cycle. It is just a cycle. Remember, as a glucose molecule is split into 2 pyruvates via glycolysis, this cycle happens twice per glucose molecule. So for 1 glucose molecule, what do we get? We get a gain of 4 ATP, 2 in glycolysis, and 2 in the Krebs cycle. We get 2 FADH and 10 NADH, 2 in glycolysis, and 8 in the Krebs cycle, and link reaction. 4 ATP on its own is not very much for such a complicated process. And this brings us onto the final process called oxidative phosphorylation, or the electron transport chain. This process requires oxygen and involves NADHs and FADHs being converted into ATP. So far, all of the processes are anaerobic, and thus when you are respiring anaerobically, you are only getting a net gain of 4 ATP. This isn't very much, and this is only done if our bodies are desperate for energy. The electron transport chain takes place in the mitochondria. This is a double membrane bound structure, and the important parts of it are the matrix, which is the inner bit, and the intermembrane space, the space between the two membranes. NADH and FADH deposit their hydrogens in the matrix, becoming NAD plus and FAD plus again. They are now able to collect more hydrogens from the Krebs cycle and glycolysis. Now, a hydrogen atom only consists of a proton and an electron. The body wants to get as many protons, which are positively charged, into the intermembrane space. We'll come to why later. A membrane consists of a hydrophobic or water-hating layer. As water is polar, protons are repelled by the inner membrane and cannot cross easily. The protons must cross through a protein channel, kind of like a bridge along a river. However, there's also another problem. Because respiration is a continuous process, there will always be more protons in the intermembrane space than the matrix. Therefore, in order to cross from the matrix to the intermembrane space, the protons must do it through active transport, which requires energy. However, luckily, this energy comes from the electron from a hydrogen, and is why it is called the electron transport chain. The electron maneuvers the protein channels in such a way to allow proteins to flow through them. The electron loses some energy doing this and goes along the membrane to another protein channel which requires less energy, forcing more protons through. FADH will start slightly further along the chain than NADH, as FADH is at a lower energy level. Now, two important things happen. There are many more protons in the intermembrane space than the matrix. This concentration gradient allows proteins to flow back through a membrane easily through passive diffusion. Proteins, again, can't cross the membrane directly, so another important protein channel is set up, which is called ATP synthase. As protons flow back to a matrix, they turn ATP synthase, and this movement generates ATP, the most important part of respiration. Roughly, each NADH molecule generates 3 ATP each, and each FADH molecule generates 2 ATP each. Finally, this is where oxygen is needed. The protons, which have just come through ATP synthase, must combine with the electrons at the end of the electron transport chain. This makes hydrogen atoms. These hydrogen atoms combine with oxygen and form water, the final product of respiration. The electron transport chain cannot function without oxygen, and is thus only part of aerobic respiration. To recap, we have glucose. Glucose breaks down and we form 2 ATP and 2 NADH. We then go through the link reaction and form CO2, and 8 NADH, 2 FADH and 2 ATP, also the Krebs cycle. We put in oxygen in the electron transport chain and convert 10 NADHs into 30 ATP and 2 FADHs into 4 ATP. So we form water at the end of the electron transport chain and 34 ATP. In total, anaerobic respiration will only form 4 ATP. However, aerobic respiration will form 38 ATP.